Hey, Will Chandler here, back again. I'm going to read another couple chapters of my book, Amor, Fati, The Love of One's Fate. So here we go. Chapter 6, Going Back to Maine. It was a mere matter of weeks until my mother, sisters, and I would pass back through Scranton, Pennsylvania, on our way to live at our grandparents' place in Maine again. It had been years since my grandparents had sold Riverbend Campground. They had a small place a few miles down the road from the campground, as well as a winter residence in Florida. I am not sure what straw finally broke my mother's perception of the need to stay with an abusive narcissist. On a Sunday morning, not very long after Vicky and Judas left, my mother took a right instead of a left onto the highway. We were finally leaving the main antagonist in our life. All we had was what we were bringing to the meeting at the Kingdom Hall. I remember it being a confusing mix of emotions for the first long minutes of realization that we were actually finally leaving our abusive family head behind. Not too many miles down the road, there was great relief for me and my older sister. I have a couple small typos in the book. We could breathe a little easier after over a decade of being smothered. We stopped in Scranton, Pennsylvania for a short reprieve before we were to continue traveling back to Leeds, Maine. We did not get a warm welcome. My aunt's young Jehovah's Witness elder husband was not on board with my mother leaving our abuser. I do not recall many of the details, but I do recall that we were not welcome to stay in their home any longer. Another caring Jehovah's Witness shepherd. In short order, we were back in Leeds, Maine, and living in my grandparents' place. They were gone for the winter to Florida, so we had their single-wide trailer to ourselves. My uncle was sometimes staying in a travel camper out back of theirs as well. It was slightly strange being there without Grammy and Grandpa. Everything changes in this life. I remember just sitting and looking around from different spots and taking joyful trips down memory lane. I felt safe and at peace for the first time in years. I enjoyed quite a bit of time in my grandfather's woodshop that winter. I also quite enjoyed and thrived on time in the woods. I would go for jogs through the forest on a regular basis that winter in waist-deep snow, often at night. It was a really good leg workout. I didn't have access to a weight room for a few months, so I would improvise using items from the woodshop to get some primitive weightlifting in. I remember helping my uncle refurbish a few sewing machines that winter as well in the woodshop. I love the smell of pine, lumber, and burning pine to this day. It always brings back good memories from my childhood in Grandpa's woodshop. We immediately started going to the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in Winthrop, Maine. Quite a few of the JWs there, to include some elders, knew who our family was. Those that did not were soon in the loop that some drama was going on. Unfortunately for us, the Jehovah's Witnesses were, and continue to be, quite patriarchal. Women are not on the same level as men for anything in the JW religion. Women, in my opinion, are second-class citizens in Jehovah's Witness society. As I recall it, the presiding overseer, the priest in charge locally, particularly did not seem to like my mother. I am of the belief that he was aware of much that had happened at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in Lewiston, Maine, involving child abuse in the 1980s and 1990s. My mother had to go to more than one hours-long interrogation session with the elders in the Winthrop, Maine congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. They did not seem to quite know what to do with her. She did have an advocate in the form of an elder from our old congregation in Lewiston, Maine. In my memory, he was a good man. Funny enough, he was retired military and didn't mind bucking some of the Jehovah's Witness politics in the local area. I have just decided to add a few more sentences about the elder that was on my mother's side when we returned to Maine. I think his name was Noel Roy. He worked as a mechanic out of his 2-car garage in his place on top of a hill in the Maine countryside. I remember spending a bit of time there from the ages of 5 to 12. He was the mechanic that always worked on my mother's car. I remember being slightly confused as to how he was a Jehovah's Witness elder and also received a military retirement, and this was not looked upon negatively by anyone that I could tell. When I heard it spoken of as a child, I remember it being impressive to the average JW. He was a kind and gentle soul. He had chipmunks that lived in a rock wall on his property that he would feed by hand. I remember lifting the handle of the well spout on his property to fill up the ladle that was attached with cool water on hot summer days. I remember playing with some of his primitive homemade kids' toys as well. There is not one negative feeling associated with him in my memory. In short order, we were back in a routine with Jehovah's Witness activities dominating all aspects of our life. After all, the world was ending soon, and we were the only ones chosen to survive doomsday, and we were living in the last of the last days. One of my memories surrounding this mindset involves the Awake magazine. Jehovah's Witness leadership and brainwashed Jehovah's Witnesses parrot this lie, love to say that they never predicted the end of the world. On the first couple pages of the Awake magazine, that was 32 pages published bi-monthly as my mind recalls, it said that the end of the world would be in the 20th century. They did this by claiming that the generation that saw the events of 1914 would not die before the end of the world. Going all the way back to some of C.T. Russell's earliest published writings, I remember reading Russell predicting the end of the world would be in 1914 and that Christ has returned invisibly in 1874. He revised his false predictions a few times until his death on 31 October 1916. The International Bible Students Association went through a hostile takeover and was rebranded as the Jehovah's Witnesses after its founder's death. They have continued to be focused on the end of the world as the cornerstone of their religion, a doomsday cult, until this day. We all, Jehovah's Witnesses, expected and knew that the end of the world was coming before the year 2000. Any attempt by a Jehovah's Witness to state otherwise is gaslighting. I recall the first time we, my mother, sisters, and me, attended the Kingdom Hall in Winthrop, Maine. We all got a good laugh when one of the elders thought that I was married to my mother and my little sister was my daughter. I did not look like the typical 15-year-old. Despite the drama going on between the elders and my mother, we were made to feel welcome enough. However, I do recall feeling targeted by some of the JW politics that I assume exist in most Kingdom Halls and in most human hierarchies. On a side note, I can also recall the disdain for worldly people, the term for anyone that is not a Jehovah's Witness, and sometimes even weak Jehovah's Witnesses, that seems to permeate the Jehovah's Witness culture from my perspective. I also recall a few Jehovah's Witnesses that we had known growing up. At the end of the day, life was good for a while after leaving my primary abuser, and that is how I mostly remember being back in Maine. The three of us maintained our regular pioneer status the entire time from what I remember. That is like being a local missionary. At that time, it meant that you had to do a minimum of 90 hours a month in JW field service. We jumped right into JW life at the meetings as was expected of us as well. During the course of the year that I attended the Winthrop, Maine congregation, I came to love filling in for last-minute talks. Substitute talks, we called them, which are 5-minute speaking parts. This was for JWs that did not show up for their public speaking part at the Thursday evening ministry school of Jehovah's Witnesses. I had 3 talks one night, 1 scheduled and 2 substitutes. I got very comfortable and good at public speaking by the time I left the religion at 16. I recall it being so relieving to no longer be living on eggshells as we had since I was 4 years old. There was some peace and healing to be found that year I was back in Maine. Excuse Excuse me. I also recall some severe heartache that year. Before Vicky and I had to part ways in October of 1994, we had made a plan to meet up again within 7 years and live happily ever after. Given how much I was working and able to save at the time we met, before we left Texas, I was sure that I would be able to save up enough money over the course of a few years for us to make a go of things together. Once in Maine, with very limited cash flow options and none that came close to what I was able to earn before, I lost hope of ever seeing Victoria Taryn Jones again. I remember writing a letter to Vicky in which I disclosed some of the abuse in the situation that I was now in. With my tears staining the pages, I broke up with her in a letter. Vicky never got that letter. Someone in her family intercepted it and never let her read it. To her mind, I guess I had ghosted her instead of breaking up. I never wrote to her again because I felt so bad and like a horrible person that she would never want to hear from again. I thought that I had broken her heart and that there was no forgiveness for that. I remained in love with her, and then the idea of her for many years. I guess the rest of my life. It was getting towards springtime, and my grandparents were due back from Florida soon. We had to find a place to live. We ended up living in government-assisted housing a few miles down the road. It was a trailer in the woods. We did not have much, but enjoyed our time there. I have always loved being in nature. Some days, I would go for a run down the country road at the end of the long dirt drive up the hill to our place. The road was shaded by giant trees and ran alongside a beautiful river. I also loved to explore the woods that our trailer was in. Not far away, there was a sandy section of forest with seashells everywhere. I guess it was underwater at some point. It was amazing to have months with our grandparents. Grandpa taught me much more about woodworking. I made a side table and a small hutch without help for the first time that summer. My older sister is still using them to this day. If I had stayed in Maine that winter, I was going to try to keep the woodshop open for a day or two a week. My grandfather and I had it all worked out. I also really got to know my grandfather for the first time as well. I was 12 the last time that I had seen them and had done a bit of maturing since then. I am grateful for getting the time to know him from an adult perspective. I thoroughly enjoyed his stories about his time in the military and Germany during the Korean War. I remember long, dusty days in the woodshop. Our breakfast was often varied and fun. Sometimes it was a spaghetti sandwich, sometimes cereal, eggs and bacon at times, and I particularly enjoyed the half a cantaloupe melon with ice cream in the middle. During our lunch break, we would often play cribbage, and at times I would count out 31 points for him when my brain wasn't on task. I remember being partners with him during a cribbage tournament at a gathering of his side of the family that summer. I recall not being very large compared to some of the family there. My grandfather would often joke with customers in the woodshop about his little grandson that was helping him. I fondly remember my grandmother as well from that summer, but do not have many memories that stand out. Love is the feeling surrounding her when I think of that summer. I recall my grandfather telling me to quickly turn the page when I asked him about a cute German girl in one of the army photo albums. He didn't seem to want to get in trouble for that one again, lol. I had one conversation with Mark Tremblay in the spring to early summer time frame. I was at a friend's house and used their phone to call my stepfather. I had not been paid for the last few months of work while still living in Texas. I was also angry and vented a little during the conversation. There was one witness that overheard the phone call. I directly and with a bit of anger told him that he raped me and how pissed off I was. I clearly recall his fear of how many people I might tell. I had already had a phone conversation with one of his Jehovah's Witness relatives whose family followed us to Vernon, Texas after a year, give or take. I explained about Mark being a pedophile and that he had been disfellowshipped for abusing me. She told me that she didn't believe me. I told her to go ask Jimmy or George, the two elders from his judicial, but that is why Mark had been disfellowshipped, and to watch their faces and reactions. I heard through through family that Mark, who had been staying in my cousin's bedroom, was no longer staying in their house. In short order, I received my last 2 paychecks for working for his company, Certified Cleaning. One of the last things that happened during that year in Maine was my birth father and my stepmother came up to Maine and we got to see them for a week. We had not seen them since 1991. While we lived in Texas, the yearly week-long visitation ceased. I got a picture here. It's of myself at 16 and my grandfather in the wood shop. There you go. Now on to chapter 7, Will's parting gift from the Jehovah's Witness elders. In September of 1995, my birth father and stepmother came to Maine for a visit. My older sister and I spent a week with them. It is strange for me to think back on that time, as they had no idea, and still largely don't know, the hell that we had gone through for years. It was an amazing visit and reprieve from all things Jehovah's Witness, except for the trip we took to the Kingdom Hall for a meeting. It was also a visit filled with family and love, all non-JW, of course. You know, normal stuff for most people in society. We had been back in Maine for about a year. My stepfather was out of the picture. My mother and sisters were safe, well, as safe as they could be at that moment. I was really struggling, both with the religion and living with my mother. We had different ideals and different ideas of what should happen in our family. I thought that she should be working to support her family, not receiving government benefits while knocking on doors 100+ hours a month. She never did close to the minimum standard for being a full-time pioneer of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I thought that she should have a job and support her family. Some of any money that I made working in my grandfather's woodshop was shared with the family. It also went towards our full-time preaching efforts, as all 3 of us were regular pioneers. Well, 3.5, I guess, as my little sister was with us the entire time as well, minus short respite she got staying with friends at times. My mother's refusal to get a job caused some big arguments between us. After all the years of abuse, I felt like my job was done. I had sacrificed so much already for my mother and sisters, and they didn't even know about until many years later. I just had to leave. My existence was too much of a daily reminder of all the abuses and traumas that I had endured. One of my cousins on my father's side of the family was living with my paternal grandfather, Norman Brackett, also known as Grampy. I had not thought of that as an option before, so I decided to try it out myself. I knew that I wanted to leave the life situation that I was in. I just was not yet fully sure how to do so. After getting back from my visitation with our birth father, I had a conversation with my mother. I told her that one way or another, I was leaving home. I figured my best option was with my father or his side of the family. I was going to ask, but regardless of their answer, I was leaving. I was 16 years old. She tried to convince me otherwise briefly, but shortly agreed to let me leave with the condition that I would have to meet with the elders first. I do not recall if it was the same day. I think it was the next afternoon/evening that we met 3 elders at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in Winthrop, Maine. My mother waited in the parking lot for most of the 2 to 3 hours that we were there. I thought that they were going to encourage me and try to lift me up. I was still planning on going to meetings in Virginia, of which my mother and the elders were aware. Instead of encouragement, I was attacked by the elders for hours. I had tears running down my face for much of that time, tears of disbelief, of hurt, and of betrayal by the elder body yet again. So there I sat, expecting encouragement similar to Timothy in the Bible. Instead, the elders brought a charge of masturbation against me. They were charging me with a sin, and this was part of the internal Jehovah's Witness court system. I was told by the presiding overseer that the charges had been initiated by my stepfather. I had not seen him since the morning we had left Texas a year before. I think it was obvious that my family had been through an abusive situation. More than one Jehovah's Witness had commented on my eyes at times, saying that we must have gone through some bad stuff in Texas. We had. I also have to say again that it is my belief that the presiding overseer at the time, who was leading my inquisition, knew of the pedophile ring that had existed in the Lewiston, Maine congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses and my stepfather's involvement. I know he conversed with and met with Mark more than once during the year that I was back in Maine. I was supposed to be meeting with loving shepherds of Jehovah, shepherds of a loving God. I was in shock and disbelief. I think it was an attempt to shatter me to the point that I couldn't leave to live with my non-Jehovah's Witness father. I think it was a nefarious attempt to silence me by someone complicit in the cover-up. The cover-up of what had happened to some of us Jehovah's Witness children in the Lewiston, Maine congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. Tears began to freely flow down my face. It was insidious the way they attacked me with the masturbation charge, especially considering it was my rapist that was accusing me of sinning. I was successfully blindsided. I just sat there denying everything. I was berated and attacked for well over an hour. Then came the subject of me moving to Virginia. I was met with sneers and looks of contempt. They said that there was no chance that I would remain a Jehovah's Witness if I left. Thankfully, they were actually correct. This was meant to make me feel small and insignificant. They were already aware that my life had been extremely traumatic. They knew that I had self-esteem issues, and they assumed that I would be like their other victims and seek their approval. It hardened my resolve to leave Maine and move to Virginia. By the end, I think we were at the Kingdom Hall for about 3 hours that evening. It was dark when I walked outside and down the hill to the parking lot. I do recall one elder, I think it was Skip Berger, who actually showed me a little love. Right before I got in the van to leave, his Jehovah's Witness elder exterior cracked and a loving father shone through. He gave me a hug and basically told me that I was loved. I had spent a bit of time with him during the last year, and he had become a little bit of a father figure to me. I imagine his daughter was pretty lucky to have him as a dad. I was ready to leave Maine in short order. It is my opinion that the Jehovah's Witness leadership chose to, like countless stories one can find worldwide, use a member of their flock's traumas as a way to try to control and manipulate victims of horrific abuses into silence. That's how 2 bodies of elders of the Jehovah's Witnesses handled it for me. Once again, the Jehovah's Witness that raped and beat me for over a decade was being treated kinder and with more respect than me, his victim of rapes, beatings, and everything in between for over 10 years. This was during the proceedings of the secretive private judiciary system that rules the Jehovah's Witness culture. What the actual fuck should be the natural human reaction to that? I needed a change after trauma and trauma in my life. Their encouragement was to belittle me and to try to crush my spirit during an hours-long inquisition. They were further abusing me on purpose, in my opinion. As I recall it, I did ask if I could stay with Grampy and Sandy first. Sandy was Grampy's wife and is 6 months younger than her stepson. I was still a bit wary of my father. For as long as I could remember, I was told that he was basically the devil incarnate by my mother and stepfather. I ultimately figured he couldn't be worse than Mark, and he seemed to have a sense of honor. Sandy helped bridge the gap between my father and me. She was a friendly and neutral third party to the situation. I will always value her role in my life at that time. I said goodbyes to my sisters, and my mother drove me to my grandfather's place in New Harbor, Maine. My father and stepmother met us there. We went inside, and Mom asked to speak in private with my father for a while. It felt like a long time that they were in one of the rooms with the door closed. I assumed that my mother was telling my father about some of the abuses that I had gone through. In my mind, I would not have been able to let my child leave without disclosing that bit of information to the other parent. I was wrong. My father was still unaware of what had happened. After they came out, my mother and I said our goodbyes outside for a few minutes. I was soon living in Ashland, Virginia. There we go. That's it for today. My name's Will Chandler, handler Guardian Fury. Y'all have a good one.